times. I think you'll learn something. Here's Agnes Schwartz.
Hi. Thank you for coming to our museum. I hope you learned something going through the exhibits. I'm sure you're going to take something home with you. But now I'm going to tell you no history, just exactly what happened to me. I was born in 1933, just the year that Hitler became the Führer of Germany. I was born after 8 years of marriage, very much wanted. My parents owned a store whereby they sold yard goods to tailors. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay. But they sold yard goods to tailors who made custom-made suits and all the accessories that went with it. And finally, they welcomed me into the world. I had a set of grandparents on my mom's side. I was the only grandchild in Europe. My mother had an older sister who was childless. I was her baby too. I am only telling you this so you can see that I had a wonderful early childhood, and then compared to what was coming, it's important that you know. So finally I came into this world, and the story went that my father gave the doctor an extra $100 because he wanted a little girl so badly. I don't know if that's true or not, but as a child it certainly appealed to me. Our housekeeper lived in, and she really took care of me during the week, and took me to the park and cleaned the house and cooked good meals, and she was just part of the family. My grandma and grandpa lived in a small town called Rakosliget, about an hour's train ride from Budapest, and especially during the summer I spent many wonderful days with them. They had like a mini farm. They raised chickens and ducks and geese, and raspberry bushes lined the back fence, and the aroma from the fruit that grew on the trees was wonderful, and I just loved to spend time with Grandma and Grandpa. And then I started to go to school, and that's the first time somehow Nazism came into my life. I went to a Catholic girls' school. Why? Well, the only thing I can figure out is that probably it was the best education in the area, and secondly, perhaps it was safer to send a Jewish child to Catholic school than to a Jewish school. I walked down this broad avenue to go to school, and on the left there was this big house, and on it was this strange-looking flag. And I came home from school, and I said, I know what the Hungarian flag looks like. What is this? And that's when I learned that that was the Hungarian Nazi headquarters. And of course the flag was the swastika. And they were called the Arrow Cross, and if anybody could be worse than the German Nazis, then the Hungarian Nazis were, because they were hell-bent to kill as many Jews as possible. Every morning we had a half an hour of catechism, so I became relatively well-versed in the New Testament. And a teacher came in to teach the Jewish kids our religion a couple times a week. Obviously there was no separation of church and state, as you know it here. I felt no anti-Semitism in the school. However, after school, the Jewish kids were friends and the Catholic kids friends, and we never mixed after school. I didn't even realize that until somebody asked me a question about that, and that's when I realized that all my little friends were the Jews. The system, the school system in Budapest was such that you went to school for 4 years, and then you graduated, and now depending how well you did in school, if you just did so-so, then you went on to what they called the Polgari, and that was another 4 years, and it taught you some kind of trade so you can go out in the world and make a living. And if you did well enough, you could go on to a gymnasium, which is a college preparatory school of 8 years. And my mother impressed me from before I set foot in the school that you have to do well in school. Well, the reason for that was because only 1% of Jews were allowed to make up any college class. So if you weren't at the top of your class, it was impossible for a Jew to get into the university. My mother had 2 other sisters who immigrated to the United States long before I was born, and one of them happens to be a physician, and I think my mother really wanted me to walk in Ethel's footsteps. And so anyhow, we went, after I graduated, there was a list posted on the door, and I went to look at it, and my mother, tears of joy rolled down her face, because yes, I made it into the Jewish gymnasium, and her dream came true that I could go ahead in school. This time things were still relatively peaceful. The Allies were bombing it mostly late at night. And the air raid sirens would go off, and we'd grab some warm clothes. I lived in a 3-story building. We were on the 3rd floor, and we all huddled in the basement until the all-clear signal went off. And then we went back upstairs, took off the clothes, went back to bed. In the morning, I went off to school, and my parents went off to work like nothing had happened during the night. Of course, I could smell the smoke and see the flame shooting in the sky. But our building, luckily at that time, was never hit. And life went on that way. And then came March 1944, when the Hungarian Jews' world was turned upside down, because Hitler decided Hungary was the only country in that area that they hadn't occupied long before that. And the Hungarian Jews were still living in relative comfort. As a matter of fact, when my mother's 2 sisters kept asking us to immigrate, my father's answer was always, Jews have never had it so good in Europe, and I have a well-going business, and we don't want to leave the rest of the family. Well, around 1942, my parents woke up kind of to the realities, and the immigration process actually began. We had all our papers together. Our luggage was already in Lisbon. Great big wicker baskets of stuff packed up. I can just remember them in the living room, and they were shipped out, and then the Germans wouldn't give us the visa to go through the country, and that's how we got caught up in the Holocaust. Had we been able to immigrate at that time, my life would have gone very, very differently. Well, now, as soon as the Germans crossed the border, and they crossed it, they didn't fight their way across the border because Germany and Hungary were allies, and the Hungarians welcomed them with open arms, and Hungary was undergoing a depression, just like Germany was when Hitler took over, and so they were promised all kinds of better lives, and they welcomed them. Interestingly enough, all the wonderful customers who were so friendly to my father all of a sudden didn't know he was alive and didn't want to know of him. They were scared. Well, my father lost his business. I had to stop going to school. And of course, as soon as the Germans came in, we all had to start wearing the yellow star. Anytime you stepped outside, you had to have a yellow star, approximately 10 centimeters in diameter, and sewed on sufficiently that you couldn't slip a pencil between the stitches. So should the occasion arise, you couldn't just grab it and take it off. June came along, and in June, it really started affecting us. Well, first of all, my parents, I was a small child, and they whispered around me, and they didn't want to scare me, but they must have known that something was going on in the outlying areas. And by this time, as soon as the Germans came in, within 45 days, everybody from the outlying areas, all the Jews had been deported already. Now, yes, they tried to keep it a secret, but I'm sure some of it seeped through. And enough of it that my parents moved Grandma and Grandpa in with us because they felt they were safer in the big city than in the small town. So now we had to move, and we moved maybe a block and a half, 2 blocks from where I lived, in what they called a Yellow Star building or a Jewish designated building, both meaning the same thing. There was a big yellow star on the door, and that meant Jews lived there. And now we had to share an apartment with 2 ladies, an elderly woman and her middle-aged daughter. Grandma, Grandpa, Mom, and Dad and I lived in one room, and the 2 other ladies in the other room. To me as a child, the worst part of that whole thing were the bed bugs. I've never heard of a bed bug, and they were awful. And you woke up in the morning with big welts and scratching and itching. And these ladies, well, there was a law that all the bathtubs had to be filled with water, probably so if there was a bombing or a fire, there would be some water available. Anyhow, these ladies used to go middle of the night and shake their nighties into the bathtub, and I got up to a blanket of floating bed bugs, and it really wasn't a very appetizing sight. Food was getting scarce. People had been out of work for 6 months or so, and my father wasn't working, and even if you had the money, you were only allowed to go to the grocery store late in the afternoon. By that time, the groceries were pretty well sold out, and you had to take what you could find. Now, my mother was always a businesswoman. She was never a cook, but Grandma was there, and she made do with whatever she could find, and we all had something to eat. And my grandfather got sick, and I'm not sure with what. I thought he had cardiac problems. My aunt here told me he had cancer, immaterial. He got so sick we couldn't keep him at home, and we took him to a so-called hospital. And what I recall is like if you've seen in MASH or some other old wartime movies, cots lined up one next to the other. And that was the last time we ever saw Grandpa, any one of us, and whether he died there of natural causes, of starvation, or they killed him, I still don't know. But I still had Grandma, Mom, and Dad. And then one day, a troop of Nazis marched into the building, and a gunshot rang out into the air. And with that, they ordered all the men, working age men, like 18 through 45, to line up downstairs. And this included my father, and this is November 1944. The Budapest winters are similar to cold Chicago winters, not like this winter was. So he had his heavy coat on and boots and a little backpack. And kissed us goodbye, and we were told they're taking him come someplace to work and that he'd be back. That was the biggest lie the Germans ever told. Because they told people that families would stay together, and they told people they're going to work. And of course, they were all headed for the concentration camps. So now my dad is gone, and a few days later, the same scenario takes place, and this time it's the women. Of course, that included my mother, and there she stood in front of me in her gray Persian lamb coat and her heavy boots and a little knapsack, and she did her best to put a smile on her face for me. And well, if your mom and dad were going away for a weekend and would leave you with Grandma, that's just the way she talked to me. And she said, you listen to Grandma and be a good girl, and I'll see you soon. I was 11 years old, and the soon never came because I never saw my mother again. Time goes by, and a few days go by, and it's a knock at the door. And you know, there's a knock at the door, you freeze because you think it's the Nazis, and what do they want now? So it was my father, to our surprise, and he told the story that he was in a cattle car, like you saw, in the museum, not knowing where he was going, but a couple of Nazi officers needed directions to Budapest. And it was his lucky day because he spoke a fluent German. And he became their guide. And when he came back, they let him go. So he comes home and, of course, looks for Mom, and Grandma and I tell him the story, and immediately said, I'm going to go after her. And, of course, I tug at his coat and his pants. Daddy, don't leave me. Mommy's gone, and stay with me. And even my grandmother said, there's nothing you can do for her. And Grandma was absolutely right. There was nothing he could have done for her. But he said, I don't know where they're collecting the people. It's in the brickyard. They always collected the people at the brickyard because the brickyards were situated on the railroad, and that facilitated the deportations. Once again, a few days go by, and there's another knock at the door, and this time it's Julia, our housekeeper. Now, whether my parents made up something with her that if the time got dicey, she should come and get me, or she just took this upon herself, I have no idea. I have nobody to ask. And my grandma threw her for a few articles of clothing in a brown paper bag, and I went home with her on the streetcar. And so she's talking to me, and she's telling me that what the story we're going to tell the neighbors. Well, first of all, I became her niece, and the story we were going to tell the neighbors was that the Russians were already occupying Eastern Hungary, and they wanted to send me away from the Russian occupation, and therefore they sent me to my aunt in Budapest. I took her last name. Of course, we took the yellow star off before we left the house. And then the one thing I didn't learn in Catholic school was the rosary. And she taught me the rosary on her way home. Just in case somebody should ask me some questions, I would be able to answer like a Catholic girl would know. She also told me her neighbor Teresa was a big Nazi sympathizer and that I had to be very careful what I said. Imagine the burden on an 11-year-old when you know that you can't cry and say, I want to go home. You can't laugh out too loud because that will draw attention to you. You have to watch every single step of the way not to call any attention to you. And not only was I lucky that Julia cared enough about me to risk her life to save mine, but Julia had potatoes and beans and smoked meats in her pantry. We didn't have deluxe dinners, but there was always something to eat. While most of the world starved, or at least the Jews, I had something to eat. I lived with Julia for several months, and a few weeks maybe after I moved in with her, it started raining bombs night and day, the Allies. The war was coming to an end. And this was the last hurrah for the Germans and the Nazis and the Hungarian Nazis. And I'm in a 5-story building, and this 5-story building, everybody moves to the basement. There's a stack of wood chopped up, and we all take pillows and blankets and make beds for ourselves next to each other. And the building shakes, and we live by candlelight. There's no electricity. It's winter time. There's no heat. You can't take your heavy coat off. It's cold and it's damp. But the worst part is that you've got a 5-story apartment building, no toilet facilities. So the place smells. And there was a bucket passed around and the waste thrown out during the middle of the night. And in between bombings, Julia would run upstairs and grab some food and bring it down. And this is, towards the end, the question became, what's going to kill us first, the bombs or the Nazis? Surviving really became almost impossible. And then we started traveling from building to building that the Russians were occupying Budapest, thereby freeing the Jews. And the bombing stopped, and the machine gun fire abated, and finally we stuck our heads out the basement door. Well, you're in a dark basement and you come out in January and the freshly fallen snow and the sun shining off of it, you can't see a thing. But I could smell and I can still, that odor is still in my nose. And the only way to describe it is that it was the smell of death. There were the bodies all over, there was dead horses all over. People were so hungry they were running out with a carving knife to carve up the horses for a meal. But you know what? The war was over and we were alive. Went up to Julia's apartment, where of course there was no electricity or telephone. And what happened to the rest of the family? We have absolutely no way of finding out. As I'm playing out in front of her apartment one day, my father comes walking up to me, and I ran into his arms, and my father by nature was a 6-footer, a slender, good-looking man. Well, now he was skin and bones, he obviously wasn't well. And he explained to us how he survived, and I don't know if you came across the name of Raoul Wallenberg in the museum, but he was a Swedish diplomat who saved thousands and thousands of Jews by handing them out papers that Sweden would take these people, these Jews after the war, if they survived. How my dad got the papers, as I know, I have no idea. But no, again, we don't know who else survived. After having some good food and some rest, my father started to recuperate, and he and I moved into our original apartment where now another family lived. Actually, we shared the apartment with them for a brief time until they were able to find another place to live. Life took up some normalcy once again. Although all the buildings were bombed out. I went back to school, the Jewish gymnasium. My father got his store back. And then soon after that, my father found out and then told me that a couple days after Julia took me, the Budapest ghetto was formed and all the people who had been deported were pushed into the ghetto. This included Grandma and my mother's older sister and her husband. And the Jews weren't dying fast enough for the Hungarian Nazis because it was bad enough that they were starving there and there was no sanitation and they were dropping dead like flies, but they knew that their days were numbered and they had to hasten the process. So one cold night they came and marched my grandmother and my uncle and aunt down to the shores of the Danube. They were running out of ammunition. They learned that if they wired 8 or 10 people together with one bullet, they would go to the bottom of the icy river. And that was the fate of that part of my family. Their only sin was that they happened to be born Jewish. They were good, little, bad. Hungarian Jews were always Hungarian first and then Jews. Okay, so a little time goes by and I'm walking the streets looking for my mom. I hear transports of people returning from the camp and I'm sure that my mother's coming home to me until my dad comes home one day and he's crying and he sat me down and he told me that a lady came into the store who was in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp with my mom and then my mom died of so-called natural causes, which means probably typhus and starvation. On Friday, January 13th, 1945. Well, I didn't believe it. My mommy loves me and she's coming home to me and I walked the streets looking for her. Anyhow, once we knew that there was nobody else alive, the immigration process started once again. And in January 1945, my dad and I got on a propeller plane from Berlin and flew across the Atlantic, and my dad told me all kinds of stories about this wonderful country we're going to, that I was the only girl, and because my cousins were boys, and I'd be the princess, And everybody's rich in America. You don't wash clothes, you just throw it out and you buy new. I don't know if he believed these stories himself or he just wanted his little girl to feel good. I don't know. But everything would be wonderful, and it didn't quite turn out that way. We arrived in the United States, in Chicago. My physician uncle and aunt heard him coughing. He had tuberculosis. I was separated from him again. And he went off to Winfield Sanitarium. They started me in the 3rd grade because of the language problem. I'm in a strange country with strange people. Yes, they tell me that they love me, but I don't know. These are not the family I grew up with who loved me. Everything was new and different, and no, I wasn't the princess because I was the only girl. I was the one asked to do the dishes, and there's nothing of me. I didn't ask of my own children, but this was a different society, a different world. After about a year, I learned enough English. I was able to graduate and go on to high school, and that's about the same time my father was pronounced negative, and now my daddy is coming home to me. And I can hardly wait. He's going to make a home for us, and my daddy says, I can't assimilate, I can't learn the language. And he wants to go back to Europe. It was one of the biggest blows of my life. My uncle was wise enough to say, if you insist on going back, I'll pay your fare, but I'm no way going to allow you to take the child. I will not pay for the child to go back to the country. And I bless him for that every single day. While it was very difficult for me to grow up. And you know, as time went by, I realized little by little that I was an orphan. And these people I lived with, yes, they loved me, but was it, you know, you're all number one in your parents' lives. And you have no idea how important it is to be number one. Anyhow, my time is running out. I want to leave you some time to ask questions. I graduated